I'd like to introduce to you our guest, Mr. Günther Bächler, Dr. Andrei Piontkovsky and Professor Ghia Nodia. And according to the email you all, I hope, have received, number one, the first speaker is Mr. Günther Bächler, His Excellency, with a very vast background, University of Berlin, Bremen, Basel, Harvard, academic / practicing diplomat, Ambassador of Switzerland, the country which serves as a mediator between Georgia and Russia in absence of diplomatic relation between our countries, Georgia and Russia. So he's covering this field, and I guess his task in Georgia is pretty much complicated, challenging, but as I know, he's enjoying actually his term in Georgia. We all know that. So please, Ambassador, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much for these kind words and the invitation to this discussion at Europe House. I always enjoy being here in this institution because it is one of the intellectual places in the city where we have a lot of debates, questioning professors, etc., etc. So I really enjoy being here. You mentioned Free University of Berlin, and I would like to start with a book from my previous professor. He retired in 2000, the year 2000 actually, and he wrote a book based on his experience and some of his lectures. And he also asked the question, is foreign policy really foreign policy? And he came up with a book in 2000, it's a critique of foreign policy. And in his first chapter, he started exploring options of the invention of foreign policy. It was Eckhard Krippendorf. He was one of the most creative professors I had, and so I wanted to start with him. And in this first chapter, Invention of Foreign Policy, he did not start with the Greek Empire or the Roman Empire. He started with Napoleon in Europe. Because the invention of foreign policy, of course, has to do also with building state first. You need some kind of a unit, of an entity, of a territory that is somehow not disputed, that is kind of a state, or an emerging state. So from there, and from a government, be it a king, an emperor, or a president, or a democratically elected government, you start foreign policy. So he was wondering, you know, about Napoleon at that time. He said, you know, it's amazing and somehow breathtaking how he, in his, as he said, demonial ambitions, you know, was intervening in all the countries of Europe, or all the areas of Europe, neglecting countries, the will of people, you know, having military kind of crusades, forming alliances, only just to leave the alliances afterwards, signing treaties only to violate the treaty a few days later, making friends and alliances only just to give it up after a few days or months or whatever the time frame was. So he was wondering, you know, how Napoleon defined or invented foreign policy in Europe as great policy. And he said from Napoleon onwards, everybody, all the foreign ministers of European countries and states wanted to be great politicians. It was great policy. It was forming the world, creating new world orders, defining security architectures in the region or even in a continent, like making peace from, as we say now, from Lisbon to Vladivostok. So it was great policy. You You know? And this was something for big people, for great politicians. This was just the opposite of being a minister of labor or of health or of social issues, where you had to deal with budget constraints, with real issues, with health of the people, with jobs, unemployment, all the real everyday problems of the voters. Not so in foreign policy. Here, this was somehow the abstraction of policy. You could define worlds. You could tell your voters what you're going to do. And even, he said, you know, foreign policy in a way is to start ruling over third countries and people of other countries, to establish power, and at the same time maybe losing power at home. But of course, people think, you know, since he is so powerful outside, he's ruling countries, he's making architectures, peace treaties, he must be a happy ruler, he said. And that's why people admire him, you know, the guy of the great politics. And they want to be like him. So they support him, they applaud him. And that's the way somehow Napoleon invented foreign policy, and this was somehow followed up by all the rulers afterwards. And then he comes to the critique of German foreign policy, NATO, and all these strategies, you know, during the Cold War. He said, look, even we invented a kind of system of deterrence during the Cold War, and somehow the peak, what he said, of pathology was to create a system of mutually assured destruction. So how comes that in big policy, you know, like foreign policy, people can invent a system like that in order to make peace or to avoid war over the heads of millions of people, of voters, throughout a continent or even throughout the world. So this was the real invention of foreign policy, and all the related issues, you know, when it comes to security, defense, etc., etc. So something for big politicians. And of course, what he is suggesting, and this is also my title, it's big policy, but in a way it's not. It's not foreign policy. It's very much driven by domestic policy, by the rules, by the power, by the system, by the size of a country, by, you know, who is going to be elected, which party, which alliances. So foreign policy and also the great game is very much somehow determined by domestic power games, by domestic issues. And even in democratic countries, you know, the question comes up at times when we ask, is there something like democratic foreign policy? Or is there just foreign policy? Good one, bad one, imperial one, soft one, neutral one. So in which way is foreign policy defined? And of course, his hypothesis is that big powers, the big five during the Cold War, you know, they divide the world over the heads of the populations, the people, and they try to rule in a very simplified manner. But even when it comes to my own country, Switzerland, that became neutral after the country lost a few wars and after the Vienna Congress, where the people decided, okay, Switzerland should be a neutral country, and this neutrality should be guaranteed by all the foreign powers around Switzerland. Swiss neutrality had nothing to do at the beginning with foreign policy. It was a purely internal system to make Switzerland survive, to create coherence in Switzerland, cohesion, to avoid that Switzerland is going to be divided along ethnic or language lines, you know. So it was a policy, a kind of reasonable policy to say we have an Italian-speaking part, we have a French-speaking part, we have a German-speaking part. If all these different parts would follow their own interests, would liaise with the partners outside, like Germany, France, or Italy, in particular in the 19th, 20th century, Switzerland would be drawn apart. You know, it would fall apart. It would be divided along the language lines and the ethnic affiliations. So in that sense, neutrality was very much a concept of internal logic, of internal survival, and of creating a modern nation state based on a modern constitution. So even in that sense, Swiss mediation, Swiss peace policy is a mirror of this internal policy. It's a mirror of constant facilitation, constant negotiation among different groups, among different regions, different religions, different language groups. So foreign policy is very much a reflection of that, of internal situation, is a mirror, is a kind of abstract picture of what's going on inside. That's why we have a lot of negotiations all the time. We have a consent-oriented system, even in the federal government, and this is reflected also in foreign and peace policy. So you see, it's just one example, but we can come to more prominent example also in the region. You know, after 89, the end of the Cold War, the end of the Iron Curtain, the end of the Berlin Wall, we all started from the idea now that we are creating a European security architecture, kind of peace order throughout Europe, that we accept, you know, certain values, that we accept certain orientation. We had all the documents, you know, Bonn documents, Paris Declaration, the OSCE, which was somehow comprising all the states of Europe. And we departed from the idea that foreign policy is somehow reflected in all the values that are based on the domestic issues, on domestic values like solidarity, like partnership, like social orientation and socio-economic development, you know, development also for the different regions. So we came up with Europe of the regions, cross-boundary collaboration, etc., etc. In particular, also in Central Europe, you see all this. So this was very much a reflection also of internal policy, etc. And with this idea, or maybe illusion, I don't know, we were surviving 25 years after the end of the Cold War. But now what's coming back, and maybe that's why I started with Napoleon, it seems, you know, we are back to foreign policy that is also a reflection of domestic issues, very much so, of domestic problems, of internal decisions. But we are back not on partnership, we are not back on the issue of plurality in Europe, of the small countries, of small people, of small language groups, of small ethnic groups, that all have a saying and the equal rights in Europe. No, we are back in the 19th century, maybe even back to Napoleon, where the great game is again on the table, you know, where we play about zones of influence, about intervention, about who belongs to which part of Europe, about division, about the belt of insecurity between the Baltic states and the Caucasus. So in a way, we are back to foreign policy that is driven by specific aspects of domestic constraints, of domestic problems, and the great game is back on stage. So welcome to Napoleon nowadays in 21st century. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador. So, as I gathered from your presentation, there is someone who actually brought us back to 19th century and someone who is obsessed with Napoleonic or even Hitler-like designs. So I guess we are going to discuss this somewhat during our next presentation, because I'm glad to introduce Andrei Andreevich Piontkovsky, one of the sharpest analysts and one of the most outspoken opponents of Putin's regime. And he holds a PhD in applied mathematics. That's, I think, one of the things that makes him such a good analyst, because, mathematical analysis. And my students sometimes ask me, is there such thing as another Russia, liberal Russia? My answer is yes, there is another Russia, liberal Russia, and Andrei Piontkovsky actually represents the other Russia. And he, being an outspoken opponent of Putin's regime, he is still based in Moscow. He lives in Moscow and works there. And I'm going to tell you one thing, it's much easier to be Putin's opponent living even in Georgia, not to mention America or Western Europe, but it's much more difficult to be opponent of Putin and live and work in Moscow. So, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much for invitation and for this generous introduction. Yes, I do. I am living from Moscow to and in today's discussion, it seems that my task is easiest and at the same time the hardest out of us, three of us, because today's Russian foreign policy is 100% is generated by its internal policy, and I would even say more by ambitions, mentality, complexes of one person. And this person, it's Vladimir Putin. Every foreign scholar of Russian foreign policy knows the famous Winston Churchill saying that Russian foreign policy is a mystery wrapped in a riddle inside an enigma. But I think in our case, in current times, this mystery riddle enigma have a key, and this key is plans and behavior of Mr. Putin, who is head of authoritarian kleptocracy. And there are dozens of authoritarian kleptocracy in this world. And now the leader has only one overwhelming priority in their policy: preserving in power their power forever. So he certainly perceives himself as president for life, especially after parade of Arab Spring Revolution. He watched what happened to Mr. Mubarak, especially he was impressed by what happened to Mr. Gaddafi, and he doesn't want the same problems. So if we address his policy on Ukraine, and all his foreign policy now is a 100% policy on Ukraine. His hybrid war began not in February 2014, but much earlier, in the summer 2013, when he used all instruments of pressure on Mr. Yanukovych, bullying him, bribing him, to make him refuse of signing association with European Union agreement, because he perceived this association as a threat to him, existential threat, because this agreement was not about a movement of Ukraine geographically or geopolitically. It was first of all about changing the rule of games inside Ukraine itself, of turning the same kleptocratic model of Ukraine, which is typical for post-Soviet kleptocracies, into a model of European economic and political competitivity. And success of Ukraine on the development along this border would present a mortal threat to Putin regime, because yes, we are very close with Ukraine by our mentality, and this example would provide very undesirable, in Putin's perception, example for Russian society. You may say that, well, some other republics, both republics, were very successful in their democratic and market economy development, but it's different. They are different. We all former Soviet citizen. We remember wonderful Soviet movies with excellent both actors. You remember what characters they play? German generals and American spies, usually, because they were alien. And Ukrainians are very close to us, and Ukraine should not be led to move in this direction. When he finally bribed Yanukovych into rejection the agreement, he didn't think about annexation of Crimea, but overthrow of Yanukovych regime. The peaceful anti-criminal revolution in Ukraine infuriated him. This theoretical potential threat became immediate. And he decided either to submit Ukraine completely to his rule or to dismantle it. And the first step in this direction was quite naturally annexation of Crimea. And then the second event, very important in understanding Russian foreign policy for considerable period, this was his Crimean speech, which he delivered on March 18 on the occasion of Crimea and Sevastopol formally joining the Russian Federation. I think that this speech was even more important event than even annexation of Crimea. Many observers immediately noted that this speech was a kind of remake of Hitler's Sudetian speech, which he delivered to the Reichstag on the case of annexation of Sudets. The key concept of Nazi foreign policy of 30s were literally borrowed by Putin in this speech. First of all, divided nation. We Russians are a divided nation. We should gather historical Russian land. And even definition of his opponents. You know, as also former Soviet citizens, the classical definition of enemies in Soviet Union, враги народа, enemy of people. But Putin used the term again, literally borrowed from Hitler's speeches, national traitors, национал предатели. It was absolutely new term for Russian political language. And the highest concept of all this set was the Ruski Mir, Russian war, the analogy of Hitler's Third Reich. Putin claimed his right, and not only right, but his sacred duty to protect not Russian citizen, but ethnic Russian all over the world. And even the mere very, very modest implementation of this concept of Ruski Mir immediately threatened at least to two states members of NATO, Latvia and Estonia, both of which has considerable Russian ethnic minority. And Putin not only put forward this theoretical concept, he immediately defined the next stage of his Ruski Mir gathering, Novorossiya, It also was absolutely new term for Russian political vocabulary. By Novorossiya, he defined eight Ukrainian regions in which he tried to develop his next phase of his hybrid war, this combination of regular and irregular forces, terrorist acts, cyber war, provocation, and so on. He was successful only, partly successful, as you know, in two of this region in Donetsk and Lugansk. But this hybrid war continued against both republics also. The abduction of Estonian officer, arresting of Lithuanian ship, invasion into airspace of Baltic republics regularly on daily basis, statement of our Foreign Office about so-called persecution of ethnic Russian in these countries, and so on. Moreover, his speaking heads on TV, his propaganda machine declared to us that, no, comrades, it's not a war between Ruski Mir and Ukraine. This is war which is going on terrain, on territory of Ukraine. But this is a secret war for Ruski Mir against United States of America, or even more metaphysically against Russian and Anglo-Saxonian war. By designing such ambitious agenda, Putin solved another problem very important for dictator. No dictatorship can be based just on violence and intimidation. The long-term dictatorship needs some positive mythology or ideology appealing to considerable part of population for considerable period of time. Like two classical dictatorship of 20th century, Hitler, fascism with ideology of supremacy of German race, and Stalin communist ideology. Putin tried to construct the third such big ideological project, and he much more closer to Hitler project than to Stalin. For example, one of his statements is that we Russians, we had a superior genetic code because, well, this Anglo-Saxonians, they are too mercantile, and we have additional chromosome of spirituality and all kinds of such rubbish. One of very well-known Russian politician, I call him Molotov-Ribbentrop grandson, actually he Molotov grandson, Vyacheslav Nikonov. He stated, for example, as a real Molotov-Ribbentrop grandson, that we Russian an Aryan tribe, which descended from Carpathian mountains and spread over huge Eurasian continent until the Fort Ross in California. This example just gives you some picture of this kind of madness, which is normality in Russian political, ideological life, in our informational space. And it's very important, very dangerous, not only for my country and for you, for neighbors of my country, but for all the mankind. Because if some state or some group of leaders planning a war of Russian vote against Anglo-Saxonian, vote against NATO, they certainly have in mind some plan to win this war. How is Putin planning to win war with NATO? Russian economy is backward, collapsing, oil stay economy. We see what happens with this, with it under the effect of rather mild sanctions. Our conventional army, well, maybe it's quite formidable for war with Georgia, but it's much weaker than army of NATO. He threatens the world with nuclear war. Mr. Ambassador already mentioned the doctrine of mutually assured destruction, but mutually assured destruction prevents us from one scenario of nuclear war, full-scale nuclear war, which ends in mutual suicide. Putin doesn't plan this war. Putin plans to scare the Western partners into submission, into political conception, into failure to protect both republics, just threatening them with limited nuclear war, or maybe even using very limited nuclear strikes, hoping that West will have no will and no determination to strike back. And my final point and my final picture, I left Moscow yesterday, and in this day, several intercontinental nuclear missiles, the famous Topol missiles, were deployed against among districts in Moscow, and in several others districts, the most modern anti-ballistic missile system S-300 and S-400. This showed that the state of madness in the Russian ruling clan is uncomparable. It was impossible in Soviet time. After Cuban crisis, both Soviets and the United States leaders were very cautious and never dared to blackmail each other with nuclear weapons. So when people ask, is it another Cold War? My answer is no, it's not a Cold War. It's much more dangerous than classical Cold War used to be.
Thank you, Andrei and Rich, and I would agree, unfortunately, on your last point. This is not the Cold War because actually the Soviet Union was much more responsible actor than current Russian regime. I agree absolutely. And now, Professor Ghia Nodia, I don't think that it makes much sense to introduce him and go through his biography, because in Georgia, when you mention Ghia Nodia, just Ghia Nodia. His occupation is just being Ghia Nodia, one of the most prominent Georgian intellectuals. Please, Ghia.
Thanks a lot. Okay, I will talk about Georgian foreign policy, or foreign and how Georgian policy is related to Georgian domestic policy. I would say that I would rather speak about interrelation. It's not that just domestic policy is, foreign policy is extension of domestic policy, but it also influences then the choices we make in our foreign policy, also influences what we do in what kind of policy we have within Georgia. Okay, what is Georgia's foreign policy? I mean, it's quite straightforward and fairly steady. It's European and Euro-Atlantic integration. Georgia sees its place within European family of nations. How this European family of nations sees us and our place, that's another point. I will not talk about that. But we have our quite consistent aspiration. And of course, everything is contested in Georgia, whether our today's government of Georgian Dream is really deeply and consistently committed to this European and Euro-Atlantic choice. It's a matter of disputation. Some people believe that, some people don't. But, okay, officially this is the policy. So we want to be part of European Union and NATO. We want to have good relations with all other countries, especially our neighboring countries, including Russia, but that is kind of the main choice, and the foreign policy is built around pursuing that objective. Now, why do we have this kind of policy? What is the basis of this choice? What are those considerations or interests or reasons that push us to have this choice in such a steady manner, that we have all these different governments who hate each other but continue this general line? And okay, it's easy to say that, and Georgian politicians especially quite proudly quote polls that usually 70–80% of those polled in different public opinion surveys say that we support Georgia joining NATO, we support Georgia joining European Union. These polling numbers are usually considerably better than polling numbers in Ukraine or Moldova, and that's why, I mean, our politicians usually say that, you know, the choice of Georgian people is very clear. I will come to that back, I mean, to that, but I mean, how steady that commitment, public commitment, Georgian citizens' commitment to European choice is, but so far it looks that it is really quite stable, and that because that continues for many years. And in a way, politicians, political leaders, in that sense, have no real choice. It appears that on this very principal issue, they have to follow the choice of the Georgian people. But what is this choice based on? I think there are two main reasons. One is about identity, another is about values and institutions. One would think, especially when we speak about European integration, which is supposedly, first of all, economic integration project, that it should be based also on economic considerations and calculations of economic interests. But it is, I would argue, that this calculation is not really strong in a way, or strong motive for joining Europe or joining NATO. That's not what politicians usually appeal at, and moreover, at least in our previous government, there were some people who believed that, at least in the short run, joining European Union and accepting all those complex regulations may actually be counterproductive to Georgia's economic growth, and we need much more flexible and liberal system, which would be impossible within European Union. But despite that, the same politicians who said that also strongly supported European integration. So there are some reasons which are more important than at least short-term economic considerations. Okay, why identity? What it is about identity? Okay, there is, in identity, there is something negative, what we are not, and something positive, what we are. That's how concept of identity is built. Of course, for Georgians, joining Europe is expression of the idea that we are not Russians, and we are also not Middle East. I mean, Middle East is a little bit tacit assumption. It's not so conspicuous, but still, you know, we are close here, and in our collective memory, we remember our relations with Ottoman and Persian Empire. So that's also important for Georgians, not to be part of the Middle East. But of course, on day-to-day politics, it's important that we are not Russians. And not ethnic thing that we are not Russians, because we were not Russians in the Soviet Union as well. Everybody recognized Georgians as different kind of people in Soviet Union. But it means recognition of our political identity, of that our political actorness, let's say so, that we are independent as political unit. And it is quite obvious that it is only within European kind of family of nations where a small nation may gain respect as a nation. Of course, it's joint sovereignty, etc. We understand that, but still, that's so far historically it's the only place where Europe, I mean contemporary Europe, is the only place where small nations could feel secure in being nation. The Russian world, and especially somebody like Mr. Putin, of course, cannot possibly provide this kind of security. Putin, and not just Putin, of course, a large part of the Russian political class does not take Georgians as a nation, or Ukrainians even less as a nation. They just, you know, they are nice people, they have nice food, nice songs, nice dances, but they are not political nations. That's the traditional view. That's very important, of course, consideration, but that's not the only one. It's only negative one. Identity also consists of something positive, but what is positive in our identity, in feeling of our identity, which makes us European? Are we European people by our culture and civilization and traditions? Okay, I think many Georgians would be hesitant to answer that questions. Some would say probably rather yes, some probably would not be so sure. But at least if we speak about religion, for instance, as a cornerstone of identity for many people, you know, Huntington, for instance, divides civilizations according to religions, then we should be part of the Russian world because we are Orthodox nation, so why not to be with Russia? It's then with Americans or French or whoever, with Protestants, Catholics. What have we do with them? So in that sense, the positive identity which is related, linked to this European choice, is more about values and institutions, which is the second thing. Europe, what is Europe? What is Europe today? Is it about Catholicism or what? Of Carolingian traditions? Europe is, most of all, it's human rights, it's respect for human dignity, it's rule of law, it's order, some kind of order, which we associate with Europe. It's democracy. All these things, they are Europe. So when you free economy, of course, free market, all these things constitute the concept of Europe. So once you choose that, once you make a choice in that direction, it means that you choose those values and those institutions and practices which are based on those values. This is basically the content of European choice. Now, what about that? Is Georgian society so much a kind of really society which internalized, really European, which is tolerant to minorities, which is respectful of individual rights or rule of law? Can we say confidently that we are like that, and that's why we want to be part of Europe? I think many Georgians would be also hesitant, saying that we are kind of real Europeans in that sense. Yes, we are a beacon of democracy in our region. President George Bush was 100% right if you compare Georgia to all our neighboring nations, but if we compare with Switzerland, for instance, ourselves, then Georgians who travel to Switzerland and come back are not so sure that we are European. So in that sense, our European identity is an aspirational identity. That's where we want to be. That's where we want to develop. And in a way, the Georgian dilemma is either we become a European nation or we become a failed nation. Either we become Europeans or we are just nothing. I think that's more or less the European discourse, Georgian European discourse. That's the content of Georgia's pro-European discourse. But this means also that our European choice, it's not only that our ideas of our people, preferences of our political elites or just elites, whoever who develop national discourses, dictate our choice. And I would say that I think from more or less from 19th century, from Ilia Chavchavadze's circle, this European choice of Georgia in that sense of values and institutions have been gradually developing and becoming kind of mainstream of hegemonic discourse, let's say so, within Georgian society. But this has also back effect, so to say. It means that it is a disciplining factor for Georgians themselves. So when we speak about Europe, what is Europe about? What is Europe's identity? Okay, I certainly will not try to give a lecture on that one, but people speak about that Europe's essence, its transformative identity. That this essence of Europe, that it transformed its own demons of the past and developed into this Kantian kind of new kind of, some people say, postmodern civilization. And in that sense, one can ask, and often people ask, does transformative power of Europe works in Georgia? Even though in Europe, Europeans don't promise us membership of European Union, etc., I would argue that it does. Maybe we want it to work more effectively, but I would say that it has a very important role in the way how Georgian institutions, domestic institutions, work. I could look, for instance, our previous government, which was, I think, the most committed pro-Western government, but it was also often criticized that, you know, what kind of Europeans you are, because your policies, your practices are sometimes autocratic. This is not how Europeans behave. And there was some ground in that, I think, some justification in that. I would say that sometimes I said, I mean, quite repeatedly, that this government is sort of Jacobin government, in a say. It's kind of avant-garde, which tries to transform the country top-down, in a way, which is not purely democratic way, but it is European way, I would argue, maybe 19th century Europe, not 21st century Europe, but historically that's how many European nations developed also, from top-down transformations. But still, I mean, the problem with all our governments, this today's one, on previous one, on the one before that, Mr. Shevardnadze's government, that we cannot develop the main kind of feature of democracy, which is the systems of checks and balances. We have one dominant power, which is initially very popular. Shevardnadze was quite popular, Saakashvili was popular, now Georgian Dream is still popular. And that's what people call democracy. So we have government which people likes, but that's not really liberal democracy. It's maybe some kind of democracy, but not really democracy. Real democracy is about checks and balances, and that we never had, unfortunately. We still don't have it. But Europe and this international community somehow plays that roles of checks and balances. I mean, it cannot play it perfectly, of course, but it somehow compensates for this lack of internal checks and balances, and has some restraining power on our government. So I think that although Mr. Saakashvili was not perfect Democrat, that's for sure, but it was because of this European and Western in general. America is also European in a sense, because of this European restraining influence, still, despite different kind of, you know, violations, Georgia was regional, let's say so, beacon of democracy. It was the first regime or first government which left through elections, which met this most basic test of democracy, which is for any government, is if you live by elections, you meet this basic test. So in that sense, it's very important how committed people and the political elite is to European ideal, not only for maintaining sovereignty of the country, but also for how democratic institutions of the country will be. If government is really and pro-democratic, and if this democratic pro-European choice is strong within Georgian public, then we have much greater chance to gradually develop democratic institutions, including maybe eventually this system of checks and balances that we we really lack. And I think if we look at kind of ongoing political processes, we have some good news, we have some bad news, and it's too early to judge whether, for instance, in the last 2 years we came closer and we are better on this way, or we are backtracking. In Georgian society, there are both views, of course, but there are some signals, some features, signs that are disturbing. I mean, I said that we have this generally, in terms of general numbers, strong support for European choice, but I would say that in reality our society can be divided roughly into 3 parts. One is a relatively small part which is really committed consistently to European ideas and understand actually what those ideas are. This is a somewhat smaller part. There is another part, I don't know, also small hopefully, which is actively opposing European choice because it's about homosexuality, promiscuity, decadence, fight against our religion and culture, etc., etc. And there is large conformist, maybe silent majority one can call it, which would go with the prevalent discourse, let's say so. And I think today's government is maybe more representative in the sense that it represents all those parts of segments of society, unlike previous government, which consisted mostly from this first one, committed Europeans, not always committed Democrats, but always committed pro-Westerners. But this one combines everybody. And also the most committed pro-Westerners, let's say so, that are represented by 2 parties, Free Democrats and Republicans. One party is already in opposition, another is sort of in semi-opposition. So there is some direction that this pro-committed, we will have less committed pro-Europeans and less people who are knowledgeable about what European ideas is in our government, but they just will inertially maybe follow this path also because Russia somehow does not allow us to choose any other path. So, but that's really, I think, somewhat concerning. And another this will be my last point, I know. Another is, of course, the developments in our society, where Russia is certainly becoming active, is everywhere. We see, for instance, I was just in Paris, and there are people concerned that Russia is financing actually directly, and it's known, it's party of Marine Le Pen, which is basically the second political force now in France, right? And in Germany, anti-European party is somehow, it found that there are some Russian connections. So Russia somehow uses this, sees this, that domestic policy defines foreign policy, right? So it tries to influence domestic policy by strengthening these pro-Russian groups. And of course, before it was considered that it's kind of Misha talk when you speak about, you know, that somebody is pro-Russian or there are some fifth column, but or maybe whatever you think of Misha, but it's reality that this kind of work is being done, and there we see this there are obvious signs of pro-Russian groups being strengthened within Georgia. So that obviously is another way in which domestic developments may influence foreign policy. I hope they will not, but that's a new development in Georgia. Thank you.
Thanks, Ghia. And now let's open discussion. And if my dear speakers, if you have comments, questions regarding each other's presentations, please welcome.
I have a theoretical, abstract question about concept of neutrality to Mr. Ambassador. It's always intrigued me that neutrality can't be absolute concept it's always relative to some conflict. A and B are in conflict between them, and some side C is staying neutral in this conflict. Like Switzerland was neutral during First, Second War, was neutral in the Second World War, and tried to be more or less neutral during Cold War, providing to both sides facilities for diplomatic talks, spy work, and so on. In current political situation, if Switzerland is neutral, is it neutral in the context of what conflict? For example, conflict between Islamic extremism from one side and international order from other, or Putin revisionism in foreign policy from one side, and European order from other. How would you describe the current neutrality of Sweden?
Thank you. Neutrality is only defined by Switzerland or in international law with regard to neighboring countries. So traditionally we have been neutral between basically France and Germany. Not to be drawn in, not to be divided, not to be partial, because this would have been the end of Switzerland. So neutrality is only a concept for national security, if you like, and also to be somehow not taken as a hostage by any side. So for instance, neutrality was always combined in Switzerland with national defense. So we have to make sure that both sides cannot benefit from taking Swiss territory in military means against the other one. So it's very narrowly defined. Nowadays, we do have basically, when it comes to world politics or international politics, we do have, of course, a combined policy of cooperation and peace promotion. So this is part of the constitution. We do have a law on peace promotion and human rights promotion. So this is our way to somehow meet the world in Europe, wherever, in all continents. The idea here is that a small country like Switzerland is only going to survive, is only going to be stable if we combine internal democracy, stability, liberal values, together with promoting international law, the adherence to international law, and some kind of a peace policy globally. I think also this could be, by the way, a model for Georgia in some way, modified, but also in this region of the world, this kind of internal stability, internal checks and balances, democracy, well-being, together with being attractive internationally in the region as a kind of a facilitator, and of course not being aggressive against neighbors. When it comes to Islamic State, to Russia, to other countries, we do not promote neutrality in that sense. We promote a peace and human rights policy. So violation of international law, gross violation of humanitarian law, gross violation of human rights, we do always condemn. So when you see the policy of the Swiss Federal Council, we see always this kind of condemnation, also as a host state, of the Vienna, of the Geneva Convention, etc. So there is no neutrality in terms of values. There is no neutrality in terms of orientation. I mean, Switzerland was always a Western country, was always a liberal country, and somehow based in these Western values. And we go on with this. Now, when it comes to Ukraine, of course, we try to play a role somehow as now chairman of OSCE in this trilateral group with our diplomat Heidi Tagliavini, to bring all sides together for some ceasefire, humanitarian issues, humanitarian corridor, things like that. We are not neutral in terms of power politics, in terms of orientation or values. But here's another issue I want to address. Nowadays, we all speak about European values, but it seems now that at the moment anything goes. I mean, the Russian president is speaking about European values. Orthodox Church is speaking about European values. The conservatives, the right wings in France or wherever are speaking about European values. The liberals, of course. Azerbaijan, as being a chair of the Council of Europe, is talking about European values, and they even pretend that they are protecting human rights in their own way. So it seems at the moment that we are in a real clash of definitions of even maybe civilization, so about defining European values for the future of this continent. And I think this is somehow the big challenge, but also the big danger, that we accept, a discourse promoted maybe through intervention, through forceful foreign policy, through imperial politics, in order to redefine these European values.
So it's entrenched tradition, but I wouldn't say that it's supported steadily by majority of people. The mere fact that Milosevic behavior was one and Yeltsin was different, because both of them reflected the mentality of their people. Serbs in their majority were very imperial ambitions and enthusiastic. That's why they unleashed 5 wars and lost all of them. Even now, excuse me for being, because I think I will be asked about these things by audience anyway, about support of this imperial ambition and policy of Putin. I would say that this so-called 84%, it's not a convincing figure. Also, sociology in authoritarian, totalitarian society is just useless. You are sitting in your apartment in Moscow and Yekaterinburg, and somebody call you and asking, are you for President Putin or not? All genetic experience, all this unique Russian genetic code will push you to say, yes, I support. There are much more serious indicators. For example, in Moscow, there were 2 big anti-war pro-Ukrainian marches in May and in September. And both were rather successful. More than 50,000 people, at least, I think much more was in September. When this group of people of openly imperial fascist-minded, like Porokhanov, Dugin, Prilepin, others try to collect meeting in favor of Novorossiya. They can't collect more than 5,000. And everything in the history is decided not by majority of people. 85% of people are always inert or passive or not decisive. Everything is decided by active minority. And I can say that in Moscow, at least, active minority of opponents of war are more efficient and they're larger than active minority of fierce, sincere supporters of this imperial ambition. And finally, about Mr. Putin. Of course, much of political class are more imperial in Russia than ordinary people. But I think nobody in political class goes as far as the risk nuclear war. Well, I think that Putin is not ready to use button now, but he plays very, very dangerous game by blackmailing West, by blackmailing, by raising stakes. He playing not chess, he playing poker. He raising checks in hope that West will not be ready to raise. It's very dangerous game, and believe me, it's not supported even many people inside his entourage. By the way, I remember one case from history, but similar case. I was very young, but well, I was already interested in politics. It's winter 52, 53. Comrade Stalin always also went clinically met the latest months of his life, and he really prepared for Third World War, nuclear war, for purge of highest nomenclature, and plus additional Jewish pogrom. And most historians agree that he was liquidated by his entourage, by another Georgian member of Politburo, because they decided that he went too far.
Thank you. Any other questions? I have a very brief question for you, Dr. Piontkovsky, and I want a brief answer because I would like to go to audience. You said that, of course, I agree with you. It's not a majority, but it's, let's say, the most educated and mobile minority, 20% according to Pareto, that defines, let's say, political development. But does that mean that it could lead us to some kind of orange revolution in Russia? Because majority of Russian population supports Putin and he's going to win elections, definitely. But minority educated, that's different story, of course. But still, could it lead us to orange revolution in Russia? The presence of strong anti-Putin educated mobile minority, which is concentrated in big cities like Russia, like Moscow and St. Petersburg.
I think Pelo's coup d'etat is a higher probability that orange.
I see. Thank you. And now I'll let's accept questions from the audience, and please identify, name yourself. Corneli, please.
I'm Corneli Ghia from Tbilisi State University. First of all, I would like to thank all presenters. It was really a nice presentation. And I would like to ask three of you, actually, the question that when we discuss the interrelations between foreign and domestic policy, to say frankly, I was expecting a little bit more emphasis in economy. Because, you know, there's many determinants of the foreign policy, but economy is one of the main subjects probably. So my question is, what is the role of economy, for instance, in three countries about which we spoke today? For instance, is there any role of economy in Russian foreign policy, especially right now? Because if you ask me, I mean, whatever the policy Putin has, it's not really, the foreign policy is not driven really by economical reasons. Same way I can say about Georgia, because it's more like, as Professor Nodia mentioned, it's more identity driven, or some, I mean, you can argue many other issues as well. And same goes probably with Switzerland, which maybe we don't know so much about Swiss case, but is it the case with Switzerland? Is economy really playing a great role in generally in formulating foreign policy agenda? Thank you.
You're asking all three of the speakers? Okay, let's start with.
Well, in Russia, it's already well clear, not only the opposition, but all experts of the government, and I think even to Mr. Putin, that kleptocracy economy doesn't work. It can't provide no success. First of all, because it's not market economy. The key instrument of market economy is absent in our country, private property. Because property is very conditional. It depends on your administrative resources. It depends on your relationship with political boss. the property of owner for a company depends on his relationship with the president. The property of food shop depends on his relationship with the local police chief. Such economy doesn't work, and what we see now, it's, I think sanctions is not a reason of this downfall of Russian economy. Its downfall is defined by its internal nature, but sanctions sharply accelerate this process. But it's not good news for prospect of democracy in Russia, because Putin's reactions to this truth was not to resign, but quite on the contrary, to shift the attitude of public from economic news by war propaganda, by this ideology of Ruski Mir, by new agenda, by creating the image of Russia as fortress encircled by enemy. I don't think that it will be very successful for a long time, but in the immediate future, Putin will act just in this way.
Okay, I sort of partly answered to Cornelius' question within my presentation. I do think that when it comes to these strategic choices of political orientations, they are not dictated, were not dictated primarily by economic considerations or economic calculations. But of course, then specific cases, these calculations also play a role. The latest example which comes to mind is, of course, the decision of Mr. Ivanishvili's government to prioritize economic relations with Russia. But okay, ultimate motives of Mr. Ivanishvili is kind of almost semi-mystical sphere where people speculate. But what we see is that, yes, we improved economic relations with Russia, but it did not affect, so far at least, our general course towards European integration. In parallel to it, we signed the CFTA with European Union. So far, we don't see, we don't see any evidence that our kind of major foreign political decisions are dictated by economic considerations.
Thank you for this question. You know, some critical observers, they would say Switzerland does not have a foreign policy, it just has a foreign economic policy, because it was always neutral when it comes to the neighbors, but we always have a very strong economic orientation towards outside world. We have a strong export orientation, neighbors, but also down to China. For instance, we are one of the biggest investors in Poland nowadays with 5 billion. So this is one of the Swiss way to connect with the world. We have, as another example, every day, you know, about 1 million people commuting between Switzerland and the neighboring countries, Italy, Germany, around. There is a kind of exchange of economic goods every day of more than $1 billion every day, you know, with the neighboring countries in all directions. So it's highly integrated in the European economic space. And that's why we say, you know, economic policy, foreign policy is maybe the most important field. When it comes now to the crisis in Europe, you may answer your question by a kind of negative picture and saying, look, the sanctions now, the sanction regime imposed also now by European Union, all Western countries, United States towards Russia, is part of a foreign economic policy in the negative sense. The idea is that we use military means to deal with the conflict, but basically economic weapon. And Russia, of course, is responding with the economic weapon of gas and oil supply, or the shortage of gas and oil supply. So there is also partly at the moment an economic war going on. So economy is very much used as somehow an instrument here. The negative outcome of this might be that both sides are going to lose out of it. You know, economic struggle in Russia, shortage of income because the oil price is going down, gas is not be delivered, is suffering under this shortage. So we have cold winters, etc., etc. Could be a positive outcome also, say that there is some disengagement between Russia and the West. In Switzerland already we can see it. There is a kind of a wave of innovative, approaches towards the energy, which leads to a completely new national economy in terms of construction, use of energy, use of alternative energies, innovation in the machine industry, etc., etc. For instance, with my house in Bern, I'm completely independent of any gas and oil. I have a full-fledged ecological house, so I don't care about sanctions. We may also say in Russia, this may have an impact, less import of cars, of goods from the West may lead to some kind of an innovative development in terms of developing own industries, new industries, less dependent from foreign or economic market. So you see here is a real interaction going on. But what is interesting, we do not somehow put this at the forefront. We discuss identity questions, the question of Russian-speaking people that have to be protected in the West, the question of ethnic minorities that are under threat, being used as an instrument of foreign policy, of interventions, etc. So we, at the moment, it seems we want to redefine somehow Europe and the European space, and of course everybody wants to be the winner in this battle. And they use the economic weapon.
Next question was coming, sorry, from Mamka Kudava, and then...
Yes, thank you. My question would be to Mr. Piontkovsky. Could you please tell us something more, at least briefly, about the internal situation in Moscow and especially in the couloir, what's going to happen what's happening or what's going to happen in the coming months in the Kremlin or around in wider political class, and what's your forecast on that? So I don't ask you to answer the panel question how far and how long the regime will can survive with this falling oil prices, but something around it. Thank you.
He will survive for some time because of very specific nature of so-called Russian political elites. We watch many so-called orange revolution in Eastern Europe, in post-Soviet states, in Arab world, and success of anti-authoritarian revolution always was combination of two factors: mass movement in the street, not majority of course, active minority in the street, and very important second factor, split, so-called split of elites. Millions of people were on Tahrir, but the regime fall when generals stand up to Mubarak and demanded him to leave. In our protest movement, December 11, March 12, there was enough people in the street. 100,000 in one demonstration, 200,000, but no slightest indication of a split of elite. And if there was some serious indication. Next day, believe me, in the street will be already 500, and the regime would fall. The problem is certainly many of them, first of all, I mean so-called system liberals, such people like Shubais, Shuvalov, Dvorkovich, people around Medvedev, not Siloviki, not Chekists, but so-called system liberals. They certainly hate people, hate Putin. They have different mentality. They're irritated by the raid attack on their business by Siloviki. And, but at the same time, Putin plays a role of protector. He protects them from the society, from the people. If they help to overthrow Putin, on the first day, everyone will be happy, and on TV, in prime time, the Putin crimes and his robbery will be discussed. But on the next day, the same question will be asked to this so-called system liberals. They're also billionaires, and they got their wealth practically by the same means like Putin friends from so-called Lake Cooperative. So all this Russian elite are connected by common crimes, by common genesis of their wealth, and they are afraid of the country, of the people more than they are afraid or hate the Putin. They openly tell us about it. I may give a lot of quotation for analytic reports. This makes, they will keep in Putin, they will live in Putin bunker until the very end. So I don't expect this uprising against Putin inside it tomorrow on the day after tomorrow. But nobody knows when it happens. And the Putin military adventures is so that maybe some days it will be too far, not for the system liberals, and he will be overthrown by more reasonable military people. I know, for example, you're asking what I know about mood on the top. Not KGB people, but professional military people are very skeptical about full-scale war with Ukraine, for example. And one of the reasons why Putin didn't develop his assault in August, didn't go to take Mariupol, is because military experts are very much concerned by the level of casualties. And they understand that it will be very dangerous war. But generally, elite is still not ready to dissociate, so-called elite, of course, not ready to dissociate itself from Putin.
Mr. Bächler would like to add something.
I think, observing the end of the Cold War, I would even say we could have been prepared on the present crisis. Why? When I look back in '89, we can say that most of the countries in former Soviet space, they experienced some kind of a democratic revolution. We had at the beginning, in the more democratic countries that were democratic before the First World War, we had some roundtables, we had coalition governments, transition governments, etc., but we had some kind of revolution. In some other countries like Ukraine, Georgia, and others, we had the so-called color revolutions. These came later, but nevertheless, there were some, movements in the street. There was revolution, there was a change of governments, there was more democratic governments, there was, of course, struggling going on, except one country, and this is basically Russia, In '89, we had Gorbachev. He opened up Glasnost, Perestroika in order to safeguard somehow the communist regime, to reform it, but to keep it. And then we had the coup d'etat of Yeltsin. He introduced somehow economic system, capitalism, etc., etc. But it was basically a very chaotic period of time, you know. And it was all from above. It was somehow to keep, you know, the nomenclatura somehow alive, to avoid democratic revolution from below, to allow pluralism, to allow democratic movement. So 25 years after, we are more wise maybe, because we were just focusing on transition, on some elections, etc., and we were completely ignoring the fact that in Moscow we're still waiting somehow this kind of democratic movement.
I should develop a bit. You are absolutely right that there's enormous difference between what happened in Eastern Europe and both republics, for example, and what happened in Russia, but not only in Russia, in most of the other former Soviet republic. In those countries, you're right, two parallel revolutions have happened, democratic and national. National revolution against Soviet Empire and democratic revolution against communist rule. What happened in rest of the Soviet Union now, in retrospect, it's evident it was absolutely different. It was a deliberate plan, agenda of nomenclatura on converting their absolute political collective power in individual economic power of representative of this nomenclature. They deliberately went to privatization. The first billionaires in the Soviet Union were members of Central Committee of Communist Party, Minister of Gas Industry Chernomyrdin, who created concern Gazprom in 1989, and oil minister Oleg Perov, who created Lukoil. The only way which I slightly disagree with Ambassador, now it's evident that Gorbachev, Yeltsin, and Putin, they didn't stage coup one against others. They continued this way of nomenclature privatization, which was designed in late 80s inside Communist Central Committee and KGB.
Thank you. Name yourself and name your occupation.
Dear gentlemen, thank you for highly interesting presentations. I have two questions, actually. One for
name and occupation.
Two questions, just one for Ambassador Bächler and another to Dr. Piontkovsky. So Switzerland mediated the Russian entry, so Georgian consent for Russian entry into World Trade Organization. And actually it positioned itself as a guarantor of its implementation. I wonder what's the state of play at this moment, and should it be revisited in light of a new Russian-Abkhaz agreement on Abkhaz association to, deeper association to Russia? This is a question from Ambassador Bächler, and a question to Mr. Piontkovsky. On the one hand, it's a simple question, on the other hand, it's difficult, of course, to answer, but I would appreciate if you do. How do you see Russia in 2-3 years from now? Thank you.
You know, the political agreement that led to accession of Russia to WTO, of course, is not to be changed. And I think Georgia, in a way, benefited quite a lot from this, you know, to open the market, etc. This Abashidze-Karlsyn channel with then the wine, the mineral water, etc. And for all of us, it's good to have, of course, Russia in WTO for global rules and regulations and somehow adhering to the rules of the game. When it comes to the service agreement that is related to the monitoring of the so-called trade corridors between Georgia and Russia also through Abkhazia and South Ossetia. We are not there yet. We are about to finalize it. I think the texts are finalized. It's a question of technical details. We will discuss with either side, and in particular with the Georgian side now, whether they would like to change something, to amend it, or even to put it on a hold for a while. But this is a question basically of Georgian government and on the other side of the Russian government. Let's see, I can't answer this question. We are ready and the texts are almost finished.
During next 2-3 years, Putin regime will most probably fall because he has no resolve for prolonging it. Some new military adventures which will fail because the West is now concentrated to protect both republics even against this nuclear blackmail by placing American soldiers in this territory, which means that appearance of any polite green man in both republic automatically would mean full-scale war with United States, which Putin or his entourage will be not ready to do. But it doesn't mean that I don't see this post-Putin future very bright, because certainly there will be attempt of some transitional period, attempt to elect some legitimate executive and power and legislative power. It will be not easy because the political field is cleansed. But what I'm certain from the negative side, that Russia will not preserve its current borders, because this crisis will be one of the dimensions of 1917 and 1991, and both this crisis meant loss of some territories. One of these territories is already de facto lost. North Caucasus. We lost in war in Chechnya, and Chechnya enjoyed the level of independence much higher than Maskhadov and Dudayev could dream of. And Kadyrov is absolute ruler of this territory. Moreover, we pay indemnities to him in the form of budget transfers. He said that he got all this money from Allah. And in return, he claims former loyalty, even not to Russian state, but personally to Mr. Putin. And unfortunately, the similar situation, the situation is similar with other North Caucasian republics. Also, there is very active Islamic radical movement in these republics, and its rulers also loyal to Moscow only for huge transfers it's getting. Enormous danger Russia faces in Far East with growing demographic and economic invasion of China. And China is very jubilant over this crisis in the relationship between West and Russia. She expects to get what they perceive belongs to them in Far East automatically without any strife. So I'm not very optimistic about the future of Russia in 2-3 years, in spite of the fact that Mr. Putin most probably would leave political scene.
Thank you. And I would ask all of you to be brief, please, in your both questions and answers.
Ტექნიკური უნივერსიტეტის ნოოლოგიის ცენტრის დირექტორი. ჩემი ინგლისური არაფერ არ ვარ და იძულებული ვარ პატივიცე ქართულ ენას. ესე მე ვფიქრობ, რომ ცალმხრივად რუსეთის დადანაშაულება მიმდინარე მოვლენებში არ არის სწორი. არის რაღაცა, ესე იგი, კულისებს მიღმა მიდის უფრო მთავარი პროცესები. ამის მაჩვენებელია მაგალითად ერაყის პრეცედენტი. გამოაცხადეს, რომ ერაყში შედიან მასობრივი მოსპობის იარაღის მოტივით და აღმოჩნდა, რომ იქ იარაღი არ არის. ესე იგი, ესე გამოდის, რომ რაღაცა სხვა მოტივი არსებობდა. ეს მოტივი რუსეთისთვის ალბათ ცნობილია. და ვფიქრობ, რომ რუსეთს აქვს საფუძველი იფიქროს, რომ უკრაინაშიც იმავე მოტივით ხდება გააქტიურება დასავლეთის. ამიტომ ვფიქრობ, რომ რუსეთი გამოიყენებს ატომურ იარაღს, ეს თამაში არ არის. რაც მოხდა ერაყში, ჩვენ რა მივიღეთ? მივიღეთ უარესი მდგომარეობა, რაც იყო. უკიდურესად უარესი. საზოგადოება არ იყო მზად იქ გარეგან ასეთი ჩარევისთვის. კატასტროფა, ასეთი მსგავსი მოვლენა რუსეთისთვის იქნება გლობალური მასშტაბის კატასტროფა. ამდენად რუსეთის ეკონომიკური პრობლემებით ჩვენ საგარეო პოლიტიკას ვერ ავხსნით.
კითხვა ჩამოყალიბეთ.
ვერც ამერიკა ვერ გაუძლებდა ასეთ სანქციებს, ვერც ერთი ქვეყანა ვერ გაუძლებდა. და ესე იგი ხომ არ არის, ესე იგი აი ეს პრაქტიკა კარებს მიღმა ლაპარაკის. აი პოლიტიკა არ არის ესე იგი ლეგალური სინამდვილეში სოფლიო პროცესები ძირითადად მიდის არალეგალურ ესე იგი ლეგალურ ფორმატში. აი ესე იგი პრობლემა არის სწორედ ეს საერთაშორისო თამაშის წესების არაოპტიმალურობაში.
Who would volunteer to answer this question, but very briefly, please?
I was the only one who understood the question, so maybe there is no other candidate. Okay. You did. So you want to? Yeah. No. Okay, I think that I mean, American-led operation in Iraq war can be criticized for different reasons, but I don't see any ground to say that if Americans did something wrong in Iraq, that justifies Putin's behavior in Ukraine in any way.
Now let's, as we have a few questions, let's collect. First you, and then the lady in the red, and then my student David. And
okay, thank you. I am Georgian, University of Georgia, Tbilisi. First of all, I want to thank all three presenters for really fascinating, thought-provoking, and informative presentations. Actually, part of my questions were already sort of like stolen by previous members of the audience. So my first question is to Dr. Piontkovsky. Even though we predict the fall of the Putin regime within like 2-3 years, so how will public opinion, how will actually kind of this like the discourse follow during these 2-3 years? You mentioned that the real support for Putin's regime and his adventure to Ukraine is less than 84%. Probably it is, but it's obviously on the rise. So I see that there was some awakening of this nationalistic imperial syndrome in Russian population over the last actually like 10 years. 2-3 years ago, his rating was about in low 50s. Now it is obviously much higher. How do you think how it will develop in the future? So will it take something big, Putin's blunder, to awaken the Russian public, or it will happen thanks to this sound minority in the Russian population? And my question to Professor Nodia, it's also somehow related to the economy. So I just want to share my apprehension concerning Georgia's like path in the coming 2-3 years, and I really very interested to know how do you share it. So Georgia's European quest and like DCFTA association agreement of course, it is very positive. It's like civilizational breakthrough on the one hand, but on the other hand, it requires hard work. So there are like lots of like regulations, kind of DCFTA, and it's like 800 pages, and each page actually has its actually kind of like laws. And my apprehension is that 2, 3, 4 years go, there is no serious economic effect. It takes time. It will come, but it will not come the short term. But how do you think? And I believe. Well,
Question, please.
Okay. So my apprehension is there will be growing skepticism in Georgian society concerning the European path. Like people will start asking questions. Georgians are usually impatient, and this is sometimes a problem. Well, so why did we all needed all this? Wouldn't it be better actually kind of to look north a little bit? So my apprehension is kind of the skepticism will be another window of opportunity in Russia if, well, the predictions of Professor Piontkovsky that the regime will fall into 3 years does not materialize. Thank you.
David Batashvili, researcher at the Policy Research Group. I have a question to Mr. Piontkovsky. Right now it seems obvious that attacks by Kremlin against Ukraine aiming at undermining and subsequently destroying its sovereignty will continue, and they will certainly continue next year in 2015. In your opinion, based on the information environment inside Russia and on the messages coming from Kremlin, do you think these attacks are going to take the form, the economic and political form, or it is more likely to see another military offensive? Of course, the war is continuing right now as we speak, but I'm talking about more large-scale military offensive aimed at changing territorial control and taking over even more parts of Ukraine. Thank you.
Okay, I would like to, if there's any, no more questions at the point? Okay, let's go.
What will happen in 2-3 years? First of all, it's evident all the tendency of all economic tendency are obvious, and I already said before that this kleptocracy has no internal dynamics for development. But I don't see that economic parameters will be decisive in this dramatic change of public opinion. I think, first of all, failure of all this concept of Ruski Mir and failure of Ukrainian adventure, because it's already becoming evident during 6 or 5 months which passed from the beginning. Putin is different now. Putin is different now on his ambitions, plans. Well, he was very serious about Novorossiya in April. He plans he can get race rebellion against Ukrainian states in all eight regions. The results was 0 in 6 out of this, and something in half of territory of Lugansk and Donetsk, which now is called named so-called Lugandonia. Then, in August still, he thought about big military assault when he openly sent regular troops with great missiles, with tanks, but he stopped before Mariupol. He abandoned his plan to go to make corridor through Mariupol corridor to Crimea on a variety of reasons. First, resistance of Ukrainian army. It's becoming more and more serious. Second, he could not split, he didn't manage to split the West. The West is very determined, and any serious military action immediately provoke devastating sanctions, for example, cutting our financial system from SWIFT. And third, very important also, casualties. Casualties of Russian soldiers, which making this war is more and more unpopular. You know, it's there is already experience of actual fighting, Russian and Ukrainian soldiers, regular armies. And for Russian soldiers, it means, by the way, to fight with Russians, because 80% of Ukrainian army are at least speaking on Russian language. It's a very traumatizing experience. It does not support it by Russian society, especially in those regional cities where there are big army garrisons and where they bury dozens or even hundreds of soldiers. Society, it turned out the society proved out to be not ready for Putin's adventurous plans. And now what he is doing, he is repeating every day that, oh, I am for territorial integrity of Ukraine. I am for territorial. Well, it's partly it's hypocritical, because he really did not want to annex Lugansk and Donetsk, because he wanted to have it as a tumor cancer inside border of Ukraine, to spread chaos and instability. But now he even does not able to take them completely under his control, because they are run by competing gangs, guerrillas. Moscow changes these so-called leaders, famous Strelkov, Bes, and others. And now my impression is that he tries to convince West into what he defines as grand bargain. Well, agree with Crimea annexation, and I step by step maybe withdraw my troops from the Lugansk area. So Putin already is different. Putin, the person who invented all this adventure. What do you expect from other people? Well, there was short-term enthusiasm about Crimea. Yes, maybe 84%, maybe. I have had problem in my own family. My wife supported joining by Crimea, because Crimea, he definitely is very strong against war with Ukraine, but Crimea was perceived Russian by very special, very different case, because he belonged to Russian Federation, then to Ukraine, and so on. So maybe it's very short-term enthusiasm about taking Crimea back. But when this Putin agenda of eternal war of Russian war against our neighbors, this program of Zatulin and Migranyan of 98, program of Milosevic in Yugoslavia, which destroyed it, well, it's not accepted by Russian society. If Putin pursue it, he will be somehow stopped, because enormous majority of people will be against him. If he abandoned himself, it will be enormous loss of face for him. He discredited himself. He already has discredited himself in these ultra-nationalistic circles of our society, which already denouncing him as a traitor. So this sanity just can't last for 2-3 years.
Okay, I will answer the question on this kind of repercussions or results of DCFTA implementation. I am not really expert on that. I don't feel confident about these issues, but sort of conventional wisdom is that in the short term is more pain, in the long term maybe more of gain. But I would, in the nearest years, I personally, somehow intuitively, is more concerned about other things related to that. One is the possibility of some kind of Russian punitive actions if things go well. I mean, as I said, it was good maybe that Georgian winemakers or potato makers, whatever, can export to Russia, but it means that Russia got new leverage against Georgia by, again, she can close that and also try to influence Georgian public opinion against pro-European orientation. Then there may be some skepticism about government capacity to do all this homework, and we see some signs of not really kind of effective and concerted work of the government, and that task is really very big, as I understand, and they may be not so good about that. And also with a sort of shrinking of number and influence of people who are more kind of consistently committed to European choice on the one hand, and under considerable criticism of the Georgian government coming from Europe because of these politically motivated cases, etc. There may be some temptation with the government to blame Europe for their own failings. That's also, I think, a danger to have in mind.
Thanks, Ghia. And I have to say something. We started on time and we are finishing on time. So at least in Europe House, we are behaving like Europeans. Swiss participation. Swiss participation, maybe. Or maybe some Russian Europeans also could contribute to it, I don't know. Thanks to everyone, to our audience, to organizers, Europe House, International Center for Geopolitical Studies, German Marshall Fund and Black Sea Trust, who support this project, and of course to our speakers.